Hey everybody, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written anonymously.
Hey everybody, there is not a shred of historical evidence to support this idea, and Dan is simply regurgitating long-refuted, garbage-tier arguments, and in the process serving as a public embarrassment for all of academia.
None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors.
This is true for the overwhelming majority of ancient biographies from this time period. Whether or not the text explicitly has the author providing their name does not change the fact that many of these books would have been sponsored or dedicated to a patron who would know who they were, and the author of Luke makes it explicitly clear that he is writing for someone who knows him. Lack of explicit names in the text also wouldn't change the fact that there are other ways for a biographical work to have names associated with them, such as tags or cover pages, nor would it change the fact that as multiple gospels began circulating, people would have needed ways to make clear which one they were referring to, and one of the most natural ways of doing this is by using the author's name.
Closest we get is the Gospel of John, saying that the beloved disciple was the one who wrote these things, but the very next statement is, we know that his testimony is true. We also have the author speaking in the first person plural in the first chapter.
This is an immensely stupid argument, as we can be used by a single author. This might be referred to as an editorial or authorial we, and we see this in other ancient writers. Paul also refers to himself with we. We see this in 1 Corinthians and Romans, and these books are widely recognized as being written by Paul. John 1:24 explicitly says, this is the disciple who is writing. There is nothing confusing about this.
Now, the first person to actually assign traditional authorship to the four Gospels as we know them today was Irenaeus of Lyons.
Nope, just because Irenaeus is the first written work to attribute authorship to John does not mean this is the first time ever any person has ever attributed to John. This is just silly.
And there is not a good case to make that Papias is actually referring to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today.
This statement, as we know them today, is important here, as Papias does not need to be referring to the Gospels exactly as we have them today for him to be giving us evidence of their authorship and origin. We have a passage from Clement of Alexandria, recorded by Eusebius, which explicitly says that people begged Mark to leave behind a written record of the teachings given to them verbally, and that these became the immediate cause of the scripture called the Gospel according to Mark. Justin also says in chapter 66 of his first apology, quote, "For the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels," end quote. And then he proceeds to describe the Last Supper. Justin often refers to events that are contained in the Gospels by describing them as being recorded in the memoirs of the apostles.
Papias says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter and recorded everything that Peter said and put it together in no particular order.
As I have noted in the past, the remarks of Mark's work not being in order can reasonably be understood as Mark's failure to adhere to the stylistic and rhetorical expectations of his time, not merely chronological order. Matthew does exhibit more of these stylistic expectations than Mark, which can be the reason for Papias' remarks here. Dan is also overstating the evidence when he says these were conveyed as a sayings gospels. We are told that Peter prepared his teachings as sayings. This does not dictate anything about how they were written down by Mark.
We also have data that indicates Papias did not know of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark as we know them today. He never quotes from them.
This is an argument from silence, and a pretty crappy one, considering that what we have of Papias are fragments of his work.
He also says he doesn't really like the written accounts of Jesus' life, preferring the living voices, meaning the living people he interviewed who knew people who knew people who knew Jesus.
This is a really great example of how absolutely blatantly dishonest Dan is when it comes to representing his sources. I'm just going to read the section of Papias that Dan is referencing here. Quote, "I shall not hesitate also to put into ordered form for you, along with the interpretations, everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down carefully, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I took no pleasure in those who told many different stories, but only in those who taught the truth. Nor did I take pleasure in those who reported their memory of someone else's commandments, but only in those who reported their memory of the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think information information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice, end quote. Papias is blatantly saying he prefers to get his information from the elders or from people who directly heard from the elders, and the elders are explicitly indicated as being the apostles of Christ. Several early church writers describe Papias as being one who heard directly from the apostle John, yet Dan intentionally misrepresents Papias' words and says, oh, he just gets his information from a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy, and oh, he didn't like the Gospels either. It's just nonsense.
So what happened between 130 CE and about 180 CE when Irenaeus of Lyons already has the four traditional authors' names?
At this point, Dan just makes up a story that has no evidence whatsoever. It's literally just Dan's personal wet dream theory of gospel composition that has no support in reality.
Most likely, someone in Rome produced a single manuscript of all four Gospels and either assigned that traditional authorship in that manuscript, or someone very shortly afterwards assigned that authorship.
Just going to point out several things here. First, there does not exist a single anonymous manuscript. Second, based on what we know of how long ancient texts lasted and how long they would be used for, it's extremely plausible that the original texts of the Gospels were still known and in use in the 2nd century. In fact, Tertullian gives us strong evidence for this. In Prescriptions Against Heretics, section 36, he challenges his opponents to, quote, run over to the apostolic churches in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read, end quote. When Tertullian is arguing against Marcion, he similarly argues that his manuscripts can be shown to be the originals because they can be shown to be the more ancient. In a Paschal Treaty in 311, Peter, the bishop of Alexandria, says that they still have the autograph of the Gospel of John. Eusebius accuses heretics of writing false scriptures with their own hands, and he says they did not receive the scriptures in this condition from their teachers, nor can they show originals from which they made their copies. The implication here is that the teachers of the apostolic churches can show the originals from which they made their copies, while the heretics can't. When Augustine is arguing with Faustus about alleged insertions into scripture, he makes a challenge saying we should consult the original text.
And that manuscript then circulated widely, became very popular, and so authorship was established.
In addition to the previous issues I've raised, this does nothing to explain how this one random manuscript was able to become so dominant so quickly that we can't find a single anonymous manuscript, and how this was spread so quickly and uncontroversially to churches separated by vast geographic distances.
Now, a lot of people are going to respond, well, why aren't there competing claims of authorship? And I don't think that's a very good argument. To begin, everybody seems perfectly happy with anonymity.
This is question begging. As already noted, there is not a single shred of evidence for anonymity and a mountain of evidence of the opposite.
In the 2nd century CE, Justin Martyr, for instance, writing around the middle of the 2nd century CE, just calls them the memoirs of the apostles.
Why? Why does Justin call them memoirs of the apostles? Why does he associate them with the apostles? Where does he get that idea from, Dan? Where does Justin get that idea? The most obvious answer is that the apostles wrote them down, and people knew the apostles wrote them down. It is stupid to think that everybody just got this idea that these were memoirs of the apostles, but they also just happened to not have any idea which apostles they came from. Like, at no point did anybody ever say, oh, which one did this come from? Like, there's no way to describe this argument other than stupid.
So all it would really take would be one attempt to assign authorship that gets very widespread and popular for it to become authoritative enough that there wouldn't really be any challengers.
This is another theory straight from Dan's ass, which has no bearing in reality and directly contradicts the data we have. There is one book of the New Testament which was actually anonymous in the early church, and that was Hebrews, and people bickered about it a lot. One person didn't just propose an author and everybody hopped on board, yet supposedly one guy did this with 4 Gospels, and everybody just fell in line, and across hundreds of miles, like, no one questioned it. We don't get a whisper of anybody saying, oh no, it's this other guy, or questioning it. I'm going to end here by saying this. Anytime you hear Dan say anything at all, you should not trust it, whether it be about biblical studies, early church history, whatever. If he tells you the color of the sky, look up to double check. He consistently misrepresents the actual data and makes sloppy arguments which fail to engage with any scholars who don't already agree with his contrived position.